Assalamu alaikum. In a previous video, I analyzed a critique from a Salafist commentator on or a critique of a Salafist commentator on the Shi'a school of thought, and he did that critique from a Salafist or Hadithist perspective. And what I did was to create a video just to illustrate that the basis on which his critique was constructed, or the way he constructed his critique, was really not sound. And the criteria that he used really did not constitute fair criteria on which to do the analysis. And so that was quite a lengthy video, and I think what happened is, in this video, in this analysis of his critique, in other words, what I did was to debunk his critique of elevating the Salafist idea of Islam above the Shi'a idea or understanding of Islam. And I mean that was the gist of his video, was to argue that the Salafist vision of Islam or understanding of Islam is really sound, much more sound than the Shi'a understanding or interpretation or vision of Islam. And you can go back to that video. I'll put the link here. But a spin-off of that video was that people then, I cited certain verses because I took the critique to a specific case study. And I looked at the case study of wilayat and the concept of righteous command or righteous authority in Islam, and how differently the Salafist interprets from his source texts the idea of righteous authority to the Shi'a, and how the Shi'a comes to a completely different finding of the whole concept of righteous authority, which is a very core and important idea in Islam. So what has happened is I received some well thought through questions, critical comments on my video, on my ideas, and I thought I should do justice to it because people take the time to write fairly lengthy comments, and maybe they deserve a well thought through response. And that is what I did. I went and I put together a decent response. But let me first just tell you the root of the critique, or the gist of the critique. I think the critique came back to my citation of the relevant verses. And which verses are those? They are these verses. I went to these verses when I made the statement that there are a number of verses in the holy text that speak about righteous authority deserving of full obedience and subordinacy. So I highlighted this, and the point I tried to make was that since these verses occur in the Qur'an, they refer to the messenger, right? They refer to the messenger. Let me just quickly, before I go on, let me look at those verses. I'm not going to go long through each one in detail, but they are verses like, let me start with the last one, Qur'an 4:59. Heed this, you embrace the scripture, obey God, obey the messenger and those within your ranks who possess authority. Should it happen that you fall into dispute about anything, refer it back to God and the messenger. So that's one of them. There's 8:24. Heed this, you embrace the scripture, amanu. Respond to God and respond to the messenger when he invites you to that which will revive you. In other words, another verse that calls for obedience, that establishes the legitimate wilayat or authority or command of the Prophet. Let's look at this verse 4:65. And so this cannot be as real as your divine sustainer, their commitment to truth is not complete until they allow you to govern their affairs and until they accept your judgment without any reservation, complying fully with your verdict. Another verse that entrenches the wilayat, or the divinely sanctioned station of authority which the Prophet possessed. Another verse, now I'm saying the Prophet again, the messenger, right? Because I was corrected on that, the messenger. Right, but as I will explain to you later, in this particular case, the messenger is also the Prophet, right? In our times, the messenger or the Waliul Amr might not be the Prophet, but let's just quickly move to the next one. Quran 24:63, do not regard an appeal by the messenger in the same way you regard your own personal appeals to each other. God is aware of those of you who are surreptitiously evasive. Let those who undermine the messenger's command be warned that they will be afflicted by serious social upheaval, or that they will meet with painful suffering. Another serious exhortation by the mu'mineen, by the community of embracers of the scripture, to pay allegiance to the messenger. Quran 4:59 says, heed this, you who embrace the scripture, obey God, obey the messenger and those within your ranks. Okay, I guess that's a repeat of that one. 480, obedience to the messenger is obedience to God. As for those that are averse, do know that we have not tasked you with any accountability for them. So those verses unambiguously instates the messenger as a divinely sanctioned authority, worthy and deserving of obedience and subordination. So we are those who are living in the presence of the messenger are required to offer full subordination to the messenger. Now, why did I bring these verses into the discussion? The point of bringing these verses in was to show, not because what the Salafist does, the move of the Salafist or the Hadithist is to say that these verses provide ontological grounds to the Hadith books. Right? For the Salafist, this is the ontology of Hadith. It is the reification, it is the making of Hadith, the corpus of Hadith, or so-called Sunnah of the Prophet. That is how the Salafist sees these verses. When they read obedience to the messengers, obedience to God, they then draw a connecting line between that verse and Bukhari. Right? Do you see what I mean? They draw a connecting line between that verse and Ibn Kathir, Ibn Majah, Ibn An-Nasa'i. They then draw a connecting line to any and all legitimately accepted hadith books, which number in the hundreds, and the narrations number in the hundreds of thousands. So I argue that for the Shi'a scholar, they do not see rationally how you can draw a connecting line between these verses in hadith books. And what they do is they draw the connecting line between these verses and live, real human leadership. They argue that these verses are not there to justify hadith books in the post-Muhammad era, but indeed underlies or provides ontological justification to the existence of a Waliul Amr, of an office of righteous leadership. And that is how differently the Shi'i and the Salafi understands the Qur'an, because of you see, the Shi'i does not feel beholden to hadith or to narrations or narratives, weak or strong, but feel more comfortable with the Qur'an and with a rational reading of the verses of the Qur'an. So I then wrote a reply, and this reply basically addresses the issue. Now, let me just quickly show you the critique that I received at around the 29-minute mark. And, okay, let me just show you the 29-minute mark, just for... So, the verses in the Quran that call for obedience to the Prophet, right? And those are verses like Surah 4. Right, so the critique that I got was that the verses in the Quran that call for obedience to the Prophet. Now, I do realize that I have mixed up the wording, and that these verses are not in fact speaking about the Prophet, but about the messenger, right? So that is what the critique was for, and I do, right? Let me correct that quickly. So let's quickly continue. The verses in the Quran that actually regard that call for obedience to the Prophet. So he's highlighting my mixing up the word prophet for me. Then hardly 45 seconds later, you repeat the same sectarian mantra when you say these verses that speak to obedience to the Prophet. Here is the irony. All the verses you quoted said messenger. And when you read those verses out loud, you did say messenger. But when you paraphrase those verses, you nonchalantly substituted messenger with prophet, as though these two are synonymous. It is obvious that you do not understand the subtle but profound difference between the two, because if you had read and understood the Quran, you would not even dream of committing such a blatant lie. Please go read the Quran again and learn from the Quran what is the one and only duty of the messenger, and that is God chooses messengers from amongst people. Right. Please note the Quran is not chosen, selected. Ponder, think, and reflect. Right. So let me just quickly write the response. In this video, I exposed the... Right. I think that's not... Here's the answer. In the specific context of Muhammad alayhi salam, the messenger and the prophet constitute one and the same person. Yes, I agree with you that in another context, the roles may split. Moses was a messenger while Harun was a prophet, for example, and there could be other cases. I also sense your passion around this distinction, but the contrast between the two is not very relevant when invoking both titles or offices to the particular case of Muhammad alayhi salam. Unless you feel that Muhammad was a prophet and not a messenger. And I'm asking for the brother to explain to me if he thinks in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, the messenger was somebody different to the prophet. So it is, I mean, if I say my son and my son in one sentence, and then say Harun in another sentence, which is also my son, or I say my eldest in another sentence, I'm referring to the same person. You see, I'm using a different title or a different feature or different position. I agree with you. Prophet and messenger are not always the same, and that is it's a problem that people have mixed up these two terms. But I think you have been a little bit oversensitive on the matter if you look at the entire argument here. So let me go back to the argument. The argument that I actually wanted to highlight in this video, and let me just quickly give you a quick synopsis of the argument. In this video, I exposed the fallacious basis on which the featured Salafist speaker made his comparative analysis of the two biggest Muslim sects. The speaker used the pseudoscience of hadith as the sole basis from which to attack the epistemology of the Shia. And you know that epistemology means the sound basis or the sound bases that you rely on to make your claims of truth. Right? The sound root or the sound basis or the sound methodology or approach that you use to arrive at your claim of truth. So the epistemology of the Shia was attacked. In other words, the soundness of the truth claim root is questioned. What I did was to question this basis, i.e. the claimed strength of Sunni hadith over Shia hadith, because that was really the basis of the critique, was that their hadiths are inferior. They don't have good hadith books, they don't have good ilm al-rijal, they don't have good jarh wa ta'dil, they don't have good rawis, they don't have good sanad. You see, so the Shia was diminished or refuted, or at least portrayed as weak in terms of the truth claims because of the hadith problems. The hadith as a legitimate basis from which to make a judgment on the epistemology of the two schools. Hadith literature constitutes but one body of evidence in the overall epistemology of the Shia, who raise the Qur'an and logical reasoning to similar levels of importance. Now the thing here is, you see, where I find common cause with any school that promotes a rationalist methodology or a rationalist basis or root, is because I endorse the Quranic vision, which says that, which calls for tadabbur, which calls for aql. So many verses call for aql. I mean, if I must find the word aql in the Qur'an, which is intellect, and intellect is connected to rational, right? Afala taqilun. It is to reason, to think. So I cannot see how you can proceed with any human activity without aql. Aql to me is next to Qur'an. There is the Qur'an, and then there is healthy, sane reflection. And that is the call of the Qur'an, is to look at this book with a sane, healthy mind, to reason, to reflect, to tadabbur, to taqilun, to think, to use your mind, use your common sense. You see, and why I am sympathetic or defending the Shia position here is because they uphold a rationalist, logical, aql approach instead of the nas or the atharist approach. Because what Ibn Hanbal's position is, the father of the Athari or the Salafist vision or his understanding, is that you should park your aql, you should park your intellect in favor of the transmitted narration. What is narrated from the Prophet supersedes your own intellectual activity. But then, how do you convince a Christian, you see, if you are not relying on aql? Are you going to use hadith to prove to the Christian or to the atheist your position? That would be an internally contradictory, that would be an internally begging the question situation. You cannot prove somebody something from within that logic. You have to go outside of that logic to endorse the logic that you are trying to illustrate or argue for. And you cannot argue for hadith from within the hadith, you see. And that is why the claimed strength of the Sunni hadith is not a legitimate basis from which to make judgments on the epistemology of the two schools. Hadith literature consists but one body of evidence in the overall epistemology of the Shia, who raise the Qur'an and logical reasoning to similar levels of importance. Now, granted, the Shia, as opposed to my own, or as opposed to the purely rationalist approach, they rely on hadiths also, which is something that, that I don't necessarily share or agree with, because no hadith really can supersede logical reasoning and the Quran. But be that as it may, that's not the point here. So then I then used the verses you refer to illustrate how the Shia come to a completely different position on the matter of wilayat or righteous authority, i.e., by applying Qur'an and rational thinking. According to the Ahlul Hadith or the Salafist or the Atharist, wilayat, the idea of wilayat, or the institution of righteous authority, lacks an ontological basis simply because the idea of imamat or wilayat is peripheral and not central in their hadith literature. According to the Shia, on the other hand, they make the case that at least half a dozen of Quranic verses invoke the idea of wilayat or righteous authority in the lifetime of the Prophet, when these verses were revealed. So wilayat or righteous authority is in fact by these verses granted to the messenger. The rational and logical inference is for these verses to maintain currency. This is a key point here. For these verses to retain currency. There ought to be the institution of righteous authority or command beyond the era of Muhammad. If not, if we do not accept that these verses have currency or have applicability beyond the Muhammad era, then these verses would meet with obsolescence. And we cannot argue for obsolescence of the Qur'an, something which is unfathomable and intolerable. The way the Ahlul Hadith deals with the conundrum of the obsolescence of the verses enjoining righteous authority post-Muhammad is to substitute the idea of wilayat with a truckload of hearsay books, hadiths. And hence, that is why I actually used the idea of the truckload of books in that video. For the Shi'a, the solution is different. Divinely sanctioned authority or righteous authority continues in the person of the Imam, who is by necessity the most qualified person in terms of the Sunnah or tradition laid down during Muhammad's era and called for in the Qur'an. And I mentioned in that video that the Sunnah of Muhammad is in fact the divine Sunnah. There is no such a thing as Muhammadan Sunnah, there is the Sunnatullah. In the specific context, the messenger and the prophet constitute one and the same person. I think that was the answer that I then offered, and as you can see, the answer is really based on these verses. And the gist of that example, that case study that I then used to illustrate how differently the Salafist and the Shias view the Qur'an that is why these verses were used. These verses were not, the central feature of that verse, but in any case, I think it's good that we've had the question, and this video then serves, I think, to enforce the idea that you cannot get the idea of wilayat or righteous leadership in the hadith. It's not there because Yazid and Muawiyah, they were the custodians or the overseers or the funders of the whole project. You see, the biggest narrator of hadith, Abu Huraira, he was on the payroll of the Umayyads. He was working for the people, and he was a hadith master. So obviously, the idea of the Waliul Amr, or the idea of wilayat, or the idea of righteous leadership, or leadership in the image or in the example of Muhammad, did not come up. Those hadiths. Imagine Abu Huraira has to write a hadith that says that the Prophet said that the king do not be like the Roman kings who live in palaces. And imagine he had to make up a hadith like that for Muawiyah. His head would fly in a day or two, or Yazid. We know that these guys used to chop off heads for misspeaking, or for being apparently opposing their rule. So hadith literature doesn't contain the idea of wilayat. It's very weak. I don't think there's a chapter of wilayat in Bukhari or Muslim. You can correct me if I'm wrong. There's no chapter on righteous rulership. There's nothing of that. In fact, if you look at Shafi'i scholars, then they skirt around the issue. They actually do not require the Waliul Amr, the commander of the believers, to be a righteous or just person. It's not a fiqh requirement, which is for me unthinkable. How can we follow an unjust ruler? How can we legitimize an unjust ruler? Well, what these verses do is that they make two things compulsory. Number one, obedience and just rulership. You see, what the Salafists see from these verses is they enjoin hadith books. They enjoin or they make hadith books farled or compulsory. And they don't actually address the idea of righteous rulership. If you have half a brain, you can see that these verses speak about just rulership and obedience to such just rulership. How can you see anything else in these verses? How can you see anything else? How can you see obedience to Yazid in these verses? When this verse says obedience to the messenger is obedience to God, how can you replace the word messenger there with Bukhari, who is serving the rich or the wealthy powers in society, or at least a fraternity of scholars? So I'm just quickly, that is in summary, the point that was made in that video. And the idea of just leadership is really an issue that needs to be explored more. Inshallah, I will try and do that in other videos. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.